before them. The ships survived in records. The plantation survived in maps. The names of enslavers survived in courthouse books. But the nations, languages, and families of the enslaved were treated as if they had disappeared into one empty word, African. Then historians began comparing shipping routes, sale notices, plantation lists, oral traditions, and modern DNA. One name kept appearing with a force that was impossible to ignore. Igbo. The discovery did not reveal that every black American came from one people.
According to the information before us here, when I saw this message some couple of days ago, I said I need to give this message a second thought before I can be able to bring it to the general public. You see that clip? Don't worry, I will show you the full clip. You are going to watch it from beginning to the end. Not minding the clip is somehow long, but I will manage to make it shorter so that you can watch it from beginning to the end. But before I allow you to do that, let me read the description of this video you are about to watch. And this video have over 40,411 views. Can you give me that? I doubt that. Even common 5,000 you can never give. But let's continue. He said, who are Igbos really are? Who are the Igbo really? And what does DNA reveal about their deeper origins? Take back home. Igbos have deep connection with America. If care is not taken, no na we be Igbo own this America. I repeat, if care is not taken, now me and you own America. But let us not go there. Let us follow it, because this documentary is not from me. Neither is it from an Hausa man or Yoruba or Fulani, but from a Westerner. Watch the video complete. When we come back here, we are going to discuss more. And as you are watching, please kindly like, share, comment, and subscribe. Follow us on all our social media handles. Oya, regardez.
Buried under 300 years of forgotten paperwork, there's a number that historians do not like to say out loud. 60%. That is the estimated share of black Americans who carry at least one Igbo ancestor. Not African ancestor, not West African ancestor, one specific people from one specific river delta in what is now southeastern Nigeria. And almost nobody has been told this, not in schools, not in textbooks, not even in most family trees. What you're about to hear is not a story about Africa. It is a story about America, and about a people whose bloodline became the hidden architecture of an entire nation's identity. For centuries, the story of the transatlantic slave trade has been told as one undifferentiated tragedy. Millions of people, stripped of names, stripped of nations, stripped of anything that could be traced back. That is the version most of us grew up with. A void, a blank space where identity used to be. But that version is wrong, and it has been wrong for a long time. Because buried inside shipping manifests, plantation ledgers, court records, and now inside 21st century DNA databases is a pattern too consistent to be a coincidence. One ethnic group did not simply disappear into the anonymous mass of African. One ethnic group left fingerprints so deep that they reshaped the culture, the language, and even the bloodstream of an entire country. That group was the Igbo. And what happened to them, and because of them, is one of the most undertold chapters in American history. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Historians who study the Bight of Biafra, the West African coastal region that includes what is now southeastern Nigeria, have pieced together a staggering figure. Of the 1.7 million people forced out of that region during the entire era of the Atlantic slave trade, roughly 1.3 million of them were Igbo. Read that again. Not a minority within a larger group, the overwhelming majority. This was not a scattering of individuals swept up alongside other ethnicities. This was a targeted, sustained generational extraction of one people, funneled through specific ports, Calabar, Bonny, the Niger Delta, and loaded onto ships bound overwhelmingly for one destination above all others, the American colony of Virginia. And this is where the story stops being about Africa and starts being about America. Because Virginia did not receive a random cross-section of enslaved Africans. Virginia became, in the words of historians who have spent their careers on this exact question, something close to an extension of Igbo land itself. Of the roughly 37,000 Africans recorded arriving in Virginia from the Calabar region during the 1700s, an estimated 30,000 of them were Igbo. Some researchers place the share of Biafran captives among all people trafficked into Virginia at somewhere between 30 and 45%, and of those, as many as 80% were Igbo. In parts of the 18th century, Igbo people made up more than 30% of the entire enslaved population of the Virginia Tidewater. Some historians have gone so far as to nickname colonial Virginia Igbo land, not as poetry, as a demographic fact. Think about what that actually means. It means that when we talk about the founding of American slave society, the Chesapeake, the tobacco economy, the plantation culture that would go on to define the antebellum South, we're not talking about a generic African import. We are talking, in large part, about the forced transplantation of one specific West African civilization onto American soil in numbers large enough to shape the culture from the ground up. Historian Douglas Chambers, who spent years reconstructing this history, described what happened in Virginia as a process of Igboization, the slow, forced, and largely unacknowledged transformation of early African American culture into something built on Igbo foundations. That is not a footnote. That is a rewriting of the origin story of Black America. But here is where it gets worse, or, depending on how you look at it, more remarkable. This wasn't a one-time historical accident that faded out. The concentration was so deep and so sustained across generations that its effects rippled forward for centuries. Chambers, after years of archival work, arrived at an estimate that should stop anyone in their tracks. He suggested that perhaps 60% of Black Americans today have at least one Igbo ancestor. Sit with that number. 60%. In a country where the popular narrative has always been that African American ancestry is an unrecoverable blur, too many ships, too many ports, too many centuries of forced silence, one historian is arguing that the majority of Black Americans carry a direct, traceable line back to a single, specific West African people. That is not a blur. That is a signal cutting through 300 years of static. Funeral customs, spiritual practices, methods of resistance, even patterns of community organization among enslaved people in the Chesapeake. Researchers have traced threads of all of it back to Igbo cultural frameworks that never fully died, because there were simply too many Igbo people, packed too densely for their culture to be erased the way slaveholders intended. This is not chaos. This is structure. And once you understand the structure, you start to understand why the enslavers themselves treated Igbo captives so differently, with a mixture of demand and fear that shows up again and again in colonial records. Planters wanted Igbo labor because Biafran ports were, brutally, a cheap and steady supply line. But they also feared what they called Igbo rebelliousness, a reputation, recorded again and again in plantation documents, for resistance, for a refusal to simply be broken. That reputation was not a myth invented by nervous slaveholders. It has a name, a date, and a location. And it is where this story turns from statistics into something closer to legend. May 1803, Dunbar Creek, St. Simon's Island, Georgia. A group of Igbo captives, somewhere around 75 people, newly purchased in Savannah, were being transported by ship to their final destination of enslavement. Something happened on that water that has echoed through Black American memory for over 2 centuries. The captives rose up. They overpowered the crew. 3 sailors were killed in the struggle. And then, according to the accounts passed down and later corroborated by historians, the Igbo captives who had seized the vessel made a choice that no slaveholder's ledger could ever process. Rather than submit to bondage, at least 10 of them walked into the water of Dunbar Creek, singing, and did not come back out. This is where you have to stop and really sit with what you're being told. This was not despair. Read the way it has survived in Gullah Geechee oral tradition, and you find something closer to defiance carved into folklore. The story became known as the myth of the Flying Africans, the belief that the souls of those who drowned did not die at all, but flew back across the ocean, back to Africa, back to freedom, because death was preferable to enslavement, and because a soul that chooses its own ending cannot be owned by anyone. For descendants of the enslaved along the Georgia and Carolina coast, this was not a horror story to be buried. It was a story to be protected, retold, sung, and eventually sanctified. And here is where the past reaches directly into the present, closer than most people realize. Igbo landing did not stay confined to oral history and regional folklore. It surfaced in the Love Drought sequence, where Black women walked together into open water in a sequence that critics and historians alike have connected directly back to Dunbar Creek. A moment of mass resistance from 1803, involving a specific West African ethnic group, is still shaping mainstream American pop culture in the 21st century. That is not a dead history. That is a live wire. So why isn't this common knowledge? Why does the 60% figure not appear in classrooms? Part of the answer is structural. The same reason so much of African American genealogical history stayed buried for so long. Enslavers stripped names on arrival. They renamed people, broke apart families, and destroyed the paper trails that could have preserved ethnic origin. For most of American history, tracing a specific African ethnicity for a specific family was treated as functionally impossible. The prevailing assumption, reinforced for generations, was that this information was gone, permanently. And that assumption became its own kind of quiet erasure, not just of names, but of the idea that reconnection was even possible. But that assumption is now being dismantled in real time, and this is where the story escalates again. Commercial DNA testing has done something historians spent 2 centuries unable to do at scale. It has started handing back specific answers to specific families. Companies like 23andMe launched dedicated African ancestry projects, specifically to expand the reference populations available for African American customers, adding data from Nigeria and other West African nations so that a person spitting into a tube in Atlanta or Chicago could, for the first time, see a country. Sometimes even an ethnic group attached to a fragment of their own genome. Ancestry DNA has reported tens of millions of DNA samples now in its database, with over 1 trillion genetic matches connected in a single recent year alone. What used to be an unanswerable question is now, for a rapidly growing number of families, something you can literally receive in an email. But, and this is the twist most people don't see coming, the answers are messier and stranger than the marketing promises. Some families discover a large, confident Nigerian percentage on their first test, only to watch that number shift dramatically when the company updates its reference panels a year later, reallocating what used to read as Nigeria into more specific or more Bantu-linked categories. Genetic ancestry is not a fixed photograph. It is closer to a moving negotiation between imperfect reference databases and the messy, mixed, migratory reality of real human history. Genome-wide studies of African American ancestry have found people who identify as African American ranging from as little as 1% West African ancestry to as much as 99%, with a median European ancestry contribution sitting around 18 to 20%, the genetic residue of centuries of forced and coerced mixing under slavery. The story DNA tells is real, but it is not simple, and it does not arrive the way a viral headline wants it to. This is where the deeper, harder truth sits, and it is worth saying plainly instead of dressing it up. Some corners of the internet have taken the genuine, documented Igbo-American connection and pushed it somewhere the evidence does not go, toward claims that Igbo genetics trace back to a lost tribe of Israel, that DNA has proven an ancient Hebrew bloodline running through southeastern Nigeria and into Black America. This belief is real, and it matters to the people who hold it. It has deep roots inside Igbo cultural and religious identity, part of a long tradition of oral history claiming Israelite descent through figures like Eri and Gad. But it is worth being honest here. Mainstream population genetics does not support it as an established scientific finding, and Nigerian scholars themselves have pushed back hard against the idea, with historians on the ground calling the genetic version of the claim exactly what it is, unsupported. The real story does not need that embellishment. The real story is bigger and stranger and true, because the true legacy is not a mythical bloodline stretching back to the ancient Near East. It is something more immediate and more American than that. It is the fact that a specific West African people, funneled by the tens of thousands into a specific American colony in numbers large enough to reshape its culture from the inside out, went on to become, quietly, structurally, without acknowledgement, one of the primary genetic and cultural foundations of Black America itself. It is the fact that a word for a vegetable, a rhythm in a parade, a funeral custom, a reputation for defiance, and a 2-century-old myth about souls flying home over open water are not separate curiosities. They are pieces of the same buried architecture, still holding up a culture that never got to see its own blueprint. And here is the part that should unsettle anyone who thought this was simply a closed chapter of history. The story is still moving. Genealogists and DNA researchers are still refining these estimates. Pilgrimages are still made to Dunbar Creek, where descendants and diaspora communities from Nigeria, Haiti, and Belize continue to gather, pour water, sing, and mark ground that official American history rarely mentions. New documentaries are still being released, still being watched, still reopening a wound and a reclamation at the same time. Families are still opening DNA reports and discovering, for the first time in their lives, a name for a piece of themselves they were told did not exist. So the real question is not whether the Igbo shaped America. The evidence for that is no longer seriously contested by the historians who have spent careers reconstructing it. The real question is what happens next, as reference databases keep improving, as more descendants test their DNA, as more archival records get digitized and cross-referenced against slave ship manifests that once seemed permanently silent. How many more of these buried demographic truths are sitting in plantation ledgers and Bite of Biafra shipping records, waiting for someone to finally connect the dots? How many families will open an ancestry report in the next 5 years and discover that the blank space they were told was unfillable actually had a name in it the whole time? And if 60% of Black Americans really do carry Igbo ancestry, what does it mean that this number has stayed largely invisible for so long? And what else, buried in the same silence, is still waiting to surface?
Okay. Let me read what I want to read before I allow you to see the clip. Who are really Igbo? Who are they? Me and you, they are asking. This is the question. And what does DNA reveal about their deeper origins? My brother, you are more than what you think you are. That's why you see you are being made special. Let me not talk too much. For generations, the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria have been connected to powerful origin stories. Some traditions trace them to ancient migrations from the Middle East or Northeast Africa. Others emphasize deep roots within the forests and river systems of present-day Nigeria, while later oral and religious narratives link certain Igbo communities to Israelites or other distant ancestral groups. Please, come and share this video. All the very, very important. But modern genetics makes any simple one-line origin story difficult to support because DNA have proved everything. Okay, let's continue. DNA research shows that Igbos are not a population with one sudden foreign origin or one isolated ancestral source. Instead, they fit within the wider genetic landscape of West Africa, while still preserving their own regional profile shaped by long local continuity, migration, interactions, and popular mixing over time. In this documentary, which you just finished watch, you will discover who the Igbos are and why their origin has been debated. which oral traditions say about Igbo ancestry, why Israelites and foreign migration theories became popular. Igbos have 75% of the total land in the United States of America. What genetic studies revealed about Igbo population history, how Igbo DNA compare with the neighboring West African groups, why language, culture, and genetics do not always tell the same story, how migration and mixing shaped southern Nigeria, why no single theory explains the whole Igbo past and their originated. The real story is not that the DNA proved one dramatic hidden ancestry. It is that Igbo origins are deeply tied to West African and some parts of American population history, regional continuity, and centuries of interactions that shaped one of Africa's most important peoples. Which Igbo origin theory have you heard before this? Okay, the message is long and I would not like to stretch you more. Let us just see the comment sections to know what others think over this matter. Truth is Life said, yes, I agree with what you said about Igbos and other blacks. We are not the same. I am an Igbo woman and I heard that many family members we are missing. That Igbos are scattered in 4 corners of the earth. So the scattering of Igbo did not start today, my brother. We are being known as travelers. That is where they get this adage. A traveler is more experienced than a white-haired woman or man that is residing in the village. That's why you say, how far. Okay, let me continue. Okay. John Iwuji said, I am Igbo and I refuse to be a Nigerian. Okay. Igbo said, we are resilient. That's Igbo. Igbo girl Onyenyechi said, we are resilient and competitive in all we do. Igbo. Amaka. OGB John said, I am proud Igbo and refuse to be bullied by anyone. Just few days ago, 23rd July 2026, some who felt he is financially better than me tried to push, control or toy me like trash cause of the little assistance he do offer, but he was surprised to see the way I trash him and find my way out of his life. He is not God and he can never be. My people, now here we go take back break. Digest this video. Let me know what you think at the comment section of this video. You are more than what you think you are. You don't even know your ancestry. My goodness. Okay, let me end it here.